A lie, if nurtured long enough in the desert heat, doesn't die. It grows roots. In Salvation's End, the roots of that lie had wrapped themselves around every house, every soul, and now, around the neck of Elara Vance. The town had agreed to sacrifice her to protect a worse truth, a truth that was smiling with satisfaction under the brim of Judge Sterling's hat. They were about to offer an innocent life to the desert, hoping it would bury their secret forever. But roots, no matter how deep, cannot grip stone. And this afternoon, a stone named Jedediah Stone was riding into town. The rough hemp of the noose bit into the soft skin of Elara Vance's neck, a cruel necklace for her final appearance in the dusty town square of Salvation's End. Hot tears carved clean trails through the grime on her cheeks. Her hands were cinched tight behind her, the rope biting into her wrists as well. Judge Sterling's voice thundered from the gallows, a righteous sound for an unrighteous deed. He was reading her final judgment to the assembled few, maybe 50 souls, baked by the unforgiving sun. She was 21, a mender of clothes with no family to speak for her, and in less time than it takes to thread a needle, she would swing. For a theft she never committed. The charge was the theft of his wife's sapphire brooch, a jewel whose value could have bought half this hard-bitten town. But Elara had seen it all. Through the rippled glass of the parlor window, she had watched Mrs. Sterling, a phantom in the moonlight, burying that very brooch beneath the old oak in her own garden. A setup, clean and simple. But what chance did the word of a penniless needleworker have against the First Lady of Salvation's End? The crowd murmured, a mix of unease and morbid curiosity. Some looked away, others stared. This was the first public hanging here in nearly a decade, and Judge Sterling was making it a spectacle for all to see. A grim, thin-lipped man named Silas shifted his weight, and the trapdoor beneath Elara's worn-out boots groaned in protest. Her own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a desperate drumbeat trying to drown out the judge's pronouncements. She tried to pray, but her mind was blank, filled only with the bitter question, why? She had lived an honest life, worked her fingers raw since she was a child, just to afford a meager room. She locked eyes with Judge Sterling for a fleeting second. Behind his veneer of civic duty, she saw a chilling flicker of something else, relish. He was savoring this moment. He snapped the silver lid of his pocket watch shut, a sharp click that cut through the silence. He gave a curt, final nod to Silas. The executioner's calloused and steady hand reached for the lever that would send her into eternity. But it wasn't the creak of the lever that broke the silence. It was something else, a rhythmic metallic clink. Clank, coming from the saloon at the end of the square. Slow, deliberate, each step punctuated by the jingle of a rowel spur. All eyes turned to the figure that emerged from the swinging doors of the saloon. He was a man made of dust and shadows, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the unsteady gait of a man who'd had a long and intimate conversation with a whiskey bottle. His duster was stained with the sins of the trail, and he carried the scent of cheap liquor and loneliness to the townsfolk of Salvation's End. He was just another piece of tumbleweed, a drifter who had chosen the worst possible time to find a drink. But as he paused at the bottom of the gallows steps, the eyes beneath that dusty brim were anything but clouded. They were bloodshot, yes, but they scanned the scene with a sharp, sober clarity. The girl's raw terror, the executioner's grim resolve, and the judge's flushed, impatient face. Judge Sterling's face, which had been a mask of solemn duty, contorted with irritation. "This is an official proceeding of the law," he boomed, his voice echoing his importance. "Move along, drifter, before you find yourself in a cell." The stranger swayed, looking up at the platform. A slow, drunken grin spread across his face. "The law, you say?" His voice was a low rumble, slurred but carrying across the hushed square. "Well now, Judge, that's a mighty big word for what looks like a town rushing to string up a slip of a girl." He gestured vaguely towards Elara, nearly losing his balance. What in tarnation did she do? Rob the territorial bank with a hairpin? A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Glances were exchanged. The drunk might be a fool, but he was a fool asking a damn good question. Sterling's jaw tightened. She is a convicted thief. Stole a priceless heirloom from my own wife. In this town, that has consequences. The stranger let out a short, bitter laugh. From his own wife, you say? Well, ain't that a neat little package? The accuser, the judge, and the aggrieved party all sleepin' under the same roof. He paused, his gaze sharpening a bit. Seems mighty convenient. He took a deliberate step towards the gallows, his hand resting casually near the worn leather of his gun belt. I think I'll just stand right here, Judge. See how this particular brand of law plays out. Judge Sterling's face turned from red to a deep, dangerous purple. His hand went to the butt of the polished revolver at his hip. I am the law in Salvation's End, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. I suggest you get back on your horse and ride out, lest you find yourself standing next to her on that platform. The stranger, Jedediah, didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly reached inside his dusty duster. For a heart-stopping moment, the crowd thought he was going for his own weapon. But what he pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a small piece of metal, tarnished by time and the trail. He casually flipped it with his thumb, and it caught the harsh afternoon sun. Though dented and worn, the symbol was unmistakable. A star. Engraved upon it were the words, barely legible but there for all to see. Deputy. U.S. Marshal. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The nervous murmurs died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Even Silas, the executioner, froze with his hand near the lever. Judge Sterling's face lost all its color. The hand that had been resting so confidently on his revolver now seemed frozen, uncertain. Jedediah tucked the badge away. The damage was done. Now then, Judge, he said, his voice still raspy but carrying a new, hard edge of authority. You were saying something about the law? On the platform, Elara felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in days. Hope. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. But Sterling, a man accustomed to power, recovered quickly. Marshal or not, you have no authority here. This is a local matter tried and settled. Settled, is it? Jedediah said, turning to the saddlebag on a horse tied nearby, a horse no one had paid any mind to. He reached inside and pulled something out. He held it high. The sapphire brooch caught the sunlight, scattering brilliant blue fire across the dusty square. It was, without a doubt, the very piece Elara stood accused of stealing. A wave of disbelief and confusion swept through the onlookers. Sterling stared, his mouth agape. Found this not an hour ago, the marshal announced, his voice now clear and ringing, buried deep under the roots of that old oak tree. The one in your backyard, Judge. He paused, letting the words sink in. Seems a mighty strange place for a stolen jewel to hide itself, don't you think? Judge Sterling's face was as white as a burial shroud. Lies! He roared, his voice cracking with panic. This drifter is clearly her confederate. He planted that evidence to save his accomplice from the gallows. But his accusations sounded hollow, desperate. The townspeople were no longer looking at Elara with scorn. Now they were looking at the judge with a dawning suspicion. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's widow who never spoke above a church whisper, found her voice. It was surprisingly clear and steady. Judge, that Elara girl came to my home that night, right after she finished her work at your house. She was crying. Said she'd seen something strange, but she was too scared to say what. She told me the same. Added Mr. Miller, the general store owner. The girl's honest. Never owed a penny. Sterling's control over the crowd was dissolving. Like sugar in the rain. The absolute power he had wielded for years was crumbling before everyone's eyes. "Silence!" he screamed, desperation making his voice shrill. "The trial is over. The sentence will be carried out." But Jedediah was already walking up the gallows steps, moving with a sudden steadiness, his drunkenness seemingly vanished into the thin air. He approached Elara, beginning to work at the knots on her wrists. "Step away from the prisoner." Sterling bellowed, and this time he drew his revolver. The metallic click as he cocked the hammer echoed across the dead-silent square. The dark muzzle pointed squarely at the center of Jedediah's chest, all of salvation's. End held its breath. It was then that Jedediah spoke the words that would shatter not just the standoff, but the very foundations of the town. His voice was cold as steel, all traces of liquor gone. "I didn't come here for the girl, Sterling." He turned, facing the judge fully, ignoring the gun aimed at his heart. "I came here for you." A shocked silence fell. 4 years, Jedediah continued, his voice sharp as a razor. 4 years since you vanished from the Colorado territory with $50,000 of miners' payroll. Only you weren't calling yourself Sterling back then. The marshal paused, letting the words land with their full, devastating weight. "Were you Treasury Governor Elias Thorne?" The name Thorne hit the judge like a punch to the gut. The gun in his hand trembled. His composure, already cracked, now shattered completely. "Insane," he gasped, but the words had no weight. "You're insane." But the crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. They were looking at his ashen face, at his trembling gun hand, and they saw the truth written all over it. The silence of the square now had the weight of an accusation, and then, as if the drama wasn't already at its peak, a piercing scream came from the direction of the judge's mansion. Mrs. Sterling was running across the square, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs, her carefully coiffed hair now undone. She ran as if the devil himself was at her heels. "Elias, don't!" she sobbed, rushing towards the gallows steps. "You can't." She knows. She has her mother's locket. Another wave of confusion swept the crowd. Her mother's locket? Jedediah didn't miss a beat. His eyes were like steel. "What does she know, ma'am?" Mrs. Sterling climbed onto the platform, tears streaming down her face, a mess of terror and guilt. She ignored the marshal, ignored the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on her stunned husband. "The brooch," she stammered. "I didn't frame her because she stole it. I did it because she showed me something else. A memento, a small silver locket." She turned to Elara, who was staring in utter bewilderment, lost in the storm swirling around her. She said it was the only thing her father ever left her. Mrs. Sterling looked directly at her husband, her voice breaking, each word a dagger. "It has your name on it, Elias, your real name." I was scared. I was scared she would put the pieces together, that she would realize her own father. She let out a gut-wrenching sob that echoed across the square. Was the man who signed her death warrant. The revolver fell from Elias Thorne's numb hand. It landed on the wooden planks with a heavy, final thud. The fight was over. The weight of his final sin, the sin against his own blood, had crushed him. He collapsed to his knees, a broken man, exposed not by the laws of men, but by the ghosts of the past he had tried to bury. In the stunned silence that followed the confession, Sheriff Brody was the first to act. He was a quiet man, one whose presence was often eclipsed by the judge's power, but now the true law found its voice. He stepped onto the platform, picked up Thorne's revolver, and placed a heavy hand on the broken man's shoulder. "Elias Thorne," his voice was low and firm, "you're under arrest." Thorne didn't resist. He just knelt there, his eyes staring blankly at the wooden planks. Jedediah wasted no time. He drew a knife from his boot, and with one clean slice, the noose fell away harmlessly. He quickly cut the remaining ropes on her wrists. Blood began to well where the ropes had bitten deep. Elara collapsed, her legs giving out. The marshal caught her, preventing her from falling to the wooden planks. For the first time in days, she took a deep breath, one not impeded by fear or hemp. It burned her lungs. She looked up at the man who had saved her, her voice just a hoarse whisper. How did you know?" Jedediah glanced towards the sobbing Mrs. Sterling, who was being tended to by one of the townsfolk. "I didn't know about the locket," he admitted, "but I know fear when I see it. When I mentioned finding the brooch, I watched Thorne's wife. Her fear wasn't that of a common thief caught in a lie. It was deeper. It was the terror of someone hiding a far worse secret." Sheriff Brody approached them, his weathered face weary. He had taken Thorne and his wife into the custody of trusted men. "Marshal," he said, his tone carrying a new weight, "this goes far beyond a petty theft or a wanted poster. This entire town, every decision Thorne has made for the past 5 years, is now in question." Jedediah nodded, his gaze sweeping over the square, where people were gathering in small, shocked clusters. The gallows now stood not as an instrument of punishment, but as a monument to the lie that had ruled them. "I'm afraid you're right, Sheriff," the marshal replied. "What we did today was just pull on a single thread." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I have a feeling the whole tapestry is about to unravel." Thorne's study, in the back of his mansion, was a sanctuary of power. The air was thick with the smell of leather, old paper, and unchallenged authority. For years, this was where the law and salvation's end was decided. That evening, it became a crime scene. While Elara was taken to the general store by the kind Mrs. Miller, Jedediah and Sheriff Brody began their work. They weren't looking for a brooch. They were looking for the pieces of a stolen life. They found it not in a safe, but somewhere more cunning, in a false bottom of Thorne's mahogany desk drawer. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger that wasn't just scribbled numbers, but Thorne's neat, meticulous handwriting. A journal of 5 years of sin, chronicled with the cold detachment of an accountant. Every page was a knife in the soul of the town. Forged land deeds, manipulated cattle sales, verdicts decided by bribes. Elara's case wasn't an aberration. It was business as usual. "Good God, Brody," Jedediah whispered, his voice tight with anger as he read by the light of an oil lamp. "Listen to this. The O'Malley family silver claim dispute. Bribe received from Bayside Mining Corp. Ruled O'Malley guilty. Father and son sentenced to hard labor in the salt mines. Wife and daughter run out of town, penniless." Sheriff Brody went pale. "I remember the O'Malleys. Good people. Always felt something was wrong with that case." Jedediah turned page after page. Dozens of names. Dozens of ruined lives. Thorne wasn't just a thief. He was a monster who had cloaked himself in the robes of justice. Meanwhile, across town, Elara sat in the cozy kitchen behind Miller's general store, a wool blanket around her shoulders. Mrs. Miller had given her a bowl of hot soup, but her hands trembled too much to hold the spoon steady. The shock of her near death was beginning to recede, giving way to an even more terrible reality. "A part of me," Elara said softly, her voice seeming to get lost in the quiet room, "is still standing on that platform, feeling the rope." She paused, her voice trembling. "And another part is trying to understand how the man who gave me life is the same one who wanted to take it away." Mrs. Miller said nothing, simply placing a warm, wrinkled hand on hers. Sometimes there were no words. Her sympathetic silence was a more precious balm than any speech could be. The pain of salvation's end wasn't just written in Thorne's ledger. It lived in the broken hearts of its townspeople who had trusted a lie, and now it haunted the soul of a young woman who had just discovered that the monster she feared most shared her own blood. When Jedediah and Brody finally left Thorne's mansion, the moon was high in the sky, casting a cold silver light on the wounded town. The news, carried by horrified whispers, had spread everywhere. The people hadn't gone home. They gathered in small groups in the square, silent silhouettes in the moonlight, waiting. They weren't sure what they were waiting for, but they knew they couldn't face it alone. Mr. Miller, the general store owner, stepped forward as the marshal and sheriff approached. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect and uncertainty. "Marshal," he said, his voice representing all those behind him. "What now?" Jedediah looked at the tired, anxious faces around him. This wasn't a bloodthirsty mob anymore. This was a lost community. "Now we start to fix it," he said, his steady voice bringing a small measure of order to the chaos. "Thorne and his wife will be taken to Denver to face federal judgment. There will be a new judge appointed. Every case Thorne handled will be reopened. Justice will be served, however late it comes." The door to the general store opened, and Elara stepped out. She had changed into a clean dress Mrs. Miller had given her, and her hair was neatly brushed. In the moonlight, she looked strangely serene, as if facing the worst possible truth had freed her from the burden of uncertainty. She walked toward Jedediah. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice soft but firm, just loud enough for him to hear. "In the morning, somewhere west, California maybe, where I can see the ocean and forget the smell of dust and lies." "A new start," Jedediah nodded. "You deserve that." "I will never forget what you did for me, Marshal Jedediah," she said, and in her eyes was a profound gratitude that would never fade. "What about you? Will you be back on the trail, hunting another Elias Thorne?" Jedediah looked around the darkened town, at the faces looking to him for hope. "I think I'll stay here a while," he answered. "Help Sheriff Brody sort through this mess. Make sure the names in that ledger aren't forgotten." It was Sheriff Brody who voiced what everyone was thinking. "Tomorrow morning," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "the first thing we do is tear that thing down." Everyone's gaze turned to the gallows, no longer a symbol of punishment, but a tombstone for a dark era. Its wood not be used to build anything. It would be stacked in a great pile in the center of the square, and it would be burned. In that silent consensus, a town began its journey of healing.